This is Ism. Season 1, The Origins of Socialism. Paris and the Making of Modern Revolution. Ideas meet power. Prologue, The Man in the Tub. Paris, 1793. Jean-Paul Marat was much smaller than Charlotte Corday had expected. She had imagined a giant, a towering embodiment of revolutionary fury. But what she found instead was a sickly little man, slumped in a sulfurous bath, his body covered in open sores and oozing blisters. The room stank. His flesh looked like it was already decaying. To her, it seemed less like a man and more like a worm, something bloated and rotting, hidden away in its hovel after gorging on the life of a dying republic. Marat had agreed to meet her after she claimed to possess a list of enemies of the revolution, conspirators plotting a counterinsurgency in her hometown of Cayenne. Simone Evrard, Marat's companion and caretaker, had begged him not to let the strange woman in, but Marat, always drawn to plots and purges, ignored her concerns. Corday had spent days rehearsing this moment, imagining herself standing before the National Convention, dagger in hand, delivering her speech before striking down the tyrant. But now, face to face with this grotesque creature, she hesitated. Was this shriveled man truly the monster she had envisioned? Refusing to allow this hesitation to show, Corday calmly presented her fabricated list and explained the supposed plot. Marat listened carefully, pausing often to confirm names and spellings, dipping his pen into the ink and scratching them into his notebook with care. Occasionally, Simone would enter and add herbs or minerals to the steaming water, and Marat's piercing gaze would break momentarily before returning to Corday. When she had finished, Marat briefly considered the list before him and then muttered the words she had been waiting for. Their heads will fall within a fortnight. That was it. That was the moment. The mask of pity dropped. Before her was the man she blamed for the September massacres, the expulsion of her friends from the convention, the spreading reign of revolutionary terror. This man, she believed, threatened to derail the revolution itself. One life taken to save 100,000. Corday rose slowly. She set down the book she had brought, Plutarch's Parallel Lives, its title flashing for a moment in the candlelight. The ruffles of her dress fell like waves around her as she reached into her bodice and drew out a long kitchen knife. Marat raised an arm in alarm, but he was too weak to resist. Corday stepped forward and drove the blade into his chest. As the sulfur water turned a copper red, Marat cried out his final words to Simone. Aide-moi, ma chère amie. Help me, my dear friend. By the end of the week, Charlotte Corday was guillotined. At her sensationalized trial, she claimed, I killed one man to save 100,000. Marat's funeral was immense. Tens of thousands lined the streets, many of them the urban poor, the very people Marat had claimed to champion. His body was paraded through Paris with his blood-stained shirt, his bathtub, and his writing board carried like holy relics. Crowds chanted, Marat, Marat, as if invoking a secular saint. At the Corday Club, where Marat had once thundered against traitors and tyrants, his body was laid beneath a weeping willow. His heart was embalmed and placed in a glass urn at the center of a great altar, meant to inspire future generations of revolutionaries. A year later, his body would be moved to the Pantheon. During the ceremony, a delegate declared, like Jesus, Marat loved ardently the people, and only them. Like Jesus, Marat hated kings, nobles, priests, and rogues. And like Jesus, he never ceased to fight against the plagues of the people. Hi, I'm Matt Payne, and welcome to Ism. This is Paris, 1793, the radical city. To understand how a half-naked man in a bathtub could become a secular saint of revolution, we need to go back to the streets of Paris in 1789, before Jean-Paul Marat was a martyr, before Charlotte Corday was an assassin, and before the guillotine became the symbol of virtue. When we go looking for the earliest roots of modern socialism, we inevitably end up in revolutionary Paris. And this is why our season on socialism begins there today. Of course, socialism didn't come from Paris alone. It also emerged in Manchester factories, German clubs, Russian salons, and Swiss exile cafes. And not all of the earliest socialist thinkers were French, though, as we are about to see, many of them were. But Paris was just different. It was a city where people turned ideas into barricades, a city that served as an incubator for radical thought. Paris was, in many ways, the furnace that forged early socialism. Over the course of less than a century, Paris witnessed 4 major revolutionary upheavals in 1789, 1830, 1848, and 1871, with many smaller insurrections, coups, and uprisings scattered in between. This social unrest led Paris to serve as a testing ground for new ideas about freedom, equality, and revolution. Modern liberalism was in many ways born out of these revolutions in Paris, but so was the critique of liberalism. As liberal leaders of the revolution pushed for radical political change, early socialists often fought alongside them, but they always wanted to push the revolution further, critiquing the limits of liberal reform and calling attention to material issues like hunger, poverty, and inequality. As France industrialized throughout the 19th century, these critiques would grow sharper. In Paris, socialism took shape as both a rejection of the idea that political rights alone were enough and as a reaction to the horrors of early capitalism. These critiques echoed across industrializing Europe, but the radical environment of Paris created space for these ideas to flourish and to be tested. The Paris Commune of 1871, which we will cover in the last episode of this trilogy on socialism in Paris, was the culmination of a decades-long struggle, and its tragic end would cast a long shadow over the international socialist movement. Its contested legacy reveals that, from the very beginning, socialism was never a single idea. Even among its earliest advocates, there were sharp disagreements, and these divisions tended to harden over the role of the state. In the aftermath of the Paris Commune's fall, its meaning and significance were fiercely debated within the International Working Men's Association, the First International, which had become the center of the global socialist movement in the late 19th century. 2 of its most influential figures were the Russian anarchist Mikhail Bakunin and the German theorist of scientific socialism, Karl Marx. Both men fought to claim the Paris Commune's legacy for their respective movements. In doing so, they helped spark a fateful split between Marxists and Bakuninists. At the heart of their dispute was a central question: what role should the state play in transforming society? We'll dig much deeper into this, but to summarize and perhaps oversimplify, Marxists argued that it was necessary to seize the state, whether through democratic or revolutionary means, in order to remake society. Bakuninists warned that such a path would only reproduce new forms of domination. Bakunin's most famous line captured this dilemma. Freedom without socialism is privilege and injustice. Socialism without freedom is slavery and brutality. This tension, the struggle to balance freedom and equality, would animate socialist debates around the world. And as the 20th century dawned, this divide would shape the great revolutionary struggles of early socialism in Russia, in Germany, in Spain, in the United States, and beyond. So, for all these reasons, of theory and conflict, of revolution and memory, our story today begins in revolutionary Paris. The French Revolution was one of those rare events in history, like the Mongol conquests or the fall of Rome, that fundamentally reshaped the world. It was a truly earth-shattering event that did not simply topple a monarchy, but completely changed how people understood power, justice, and society. And in so doing, the revolution helped lay the groundwork for nearly every major political ideology that would follow. This is where the story of modern isms truly begins. The French Revolution reverberated across Europe. Its radical ideas and violent struggles set off a series of conflicts, the French Revolutionary Wars and later the Napoleonic Wars, that spread new political concepts far beyond France's borders. Now, this process was chaotic, uneven, and often brutal, but it planted little ideological seeds across the continent. And over the course of the 19th century, many of these seeds would grow into the isms we still debate today: liberalism, socialism, conservatism, and beyond. Paris was at the center of this transformation, a furnace of revolutionary thought, a city where ideas didn't just live in books, they were tested in the streets. The politics of the French Revolution didn't simply remake France. They set the stage for modern political ideology itself. It is no coincidence that the left-right spectrum we still use today was born in the revolutionary assemblies of Paris. The revolution cast a long shadow over Europe and beyond, a legacy that still continues to shape politics across the world. So, this is why our season on socialism begins not in a factory or a pamphlet, but in the capital of revolution itself. Now, to be clear, people in 1789 did not yet call themselves liberals or socialists or conservatives. These words came later. But if we look back with the benefit of hindsight, we can begin to see the outlines of these ideological camps emerging. The lawyers, merchants, and professionals who led the early stages of the revolution tended to focus on changing France's political institutions while preserving its social hierarchies. These reformers, seeking liberty under law, would come to resemble what we now call liberals. At the same time, radical journalists, street agitators, and the working poor pushed these political leaders to go further, calling not just for rights, but for bread. They wanted material equality, not just formal declarations. These movements, grounded in popular direct action and demands for justice from below, anticipate the ideas we now associate with socialism. And as always, there were those who longed for the return of monarchy, hierarchy, and tradition, resisting both political and social change. These reactionary forces would later form the ideological foundation of conservatism. And so now, we return to Paris, to the streets where the battle between liberty and equality first erupted, and where the long, messy birth of socialism truly began. Chapter 1. The First Commune. A quote from the Greek revolutionary Theodoros Kolokotrones. The French Revolution and the doings of Napoleon opened the eyes of the world. Nations knew nothing before, and people thought that kings were gods upon the earth. Through this present change, it is now more difficult to rule the people. The Paris of 1789 was quite a different city than it is today. The city that would witness the first French Revolution was a pre-industrial tangle of narrow medieval streets, poorly lit alleys, and overcrowded neighborhoods. Public infrastructure was sparse, sanitation abysmal. In a single neighborhood, you might find a cobbler living next door to a merchant, a carpenter above a shop, and a servant sleeping in the attic rooms of a wealthy household. The middle class, the bourgeoisie, was still emerging, weighed down by a feudal hierarchy that elevated aristocrats and clergy over merchants, lawyers, and manufacturers. But all that would soon change. In the spring of 1789, King Louis XVI was forced to convene the Estates General. And in June, the Third Estate, representing commoners holding no aristocratic or religious titles, broke away. At a tennis court near the Palace of Versailles, a group of defiant lawyers declared themselves the National Assembly, a body claiming to represent not just the aristocracy or the church, but the nation, the people. The oath they swore in that court rang out like a thunderclap across France. In Paris, it was as if the city had awoken from a long medieval slumber. As one French historian described, the air filled with, quote, an intoxication with liberty and enthusiasm. And within weeks, that enthusiasm surged into direct action. A militia of middle-class men, joined by urban workers and artisans from the Corday district, stormed the Bastille, a medieval fortress that had come to symbolize royal tyranny. The fall of the Bastille is often remembered as the beginning of the French Revolution. But in the history of socialism, it marks something even more profound. The first moment when the common people of Paris, the working poor, the sans-culottes, intervened directly in politics and reshaped the course of a revolution. In their hands, politics became something new, not a contest of elites, but a force driven by crowds, by hunger, by anger, and by hope. For the next decade, the sans-culottes would remain on the radical edge of revolutionary politics. They pressured their more cautious allies to move beyond constitutional monarchy and toward a full republic. They would fill the streets, man the barricades, and keep the revolution alive when its leaders faltered. In their militancy and their mistrust of elites, the sans-culottes became the spiritual forerunners of the proletariat, the industrial working class that Marx and other socialist thinkers would later cast as the engine of revolution. The storming of the Bastille left a power vacuum. In the days that followed, Paris established a new municipal government at the Hôtel de Ville. This was the first Paris Commune. Now, at this stage, the Commune was a moderate institution, working alongside figures like the Marquis de Lafayette, who still held aristocratic titles and who had recently been elected as the commander of the National Guard, a civilian militia created to defend the revolution and maintain order. But as foreign threats mounted and internal divisions deepened, both the Commune and the National Guard began to radicalize. Moderates like Lafayette were quickly pushed aside. Over time, journalists, agitators, and revolutionary thinkers gained influence within both institutions, and these radicals claimed to speak for the sans-culottes. And so began a long and volatile alliance between radical intellectuals and the working poor, an alliance that would continue to be a defining feature of socialist politics, from Marx to Lenin, Mao to Che. In Paris, that formula was tested for the first time. One of the earliest and most sensational figures to embrace this alliance was Jean-Paul Marat, whose fiery speeches and inflammatory pamphlets could turn a crowd on you in seconds. A physician-turned-firebrand journalist, Marat launched The Friend of the People shortly after the Bastille fell. His paper became the fiercest voice of the sans-culottes, skewering aristocrats and moderates alike. He targeted National Guard leaders like Lafayette, ridiculed the king, and attacked members of the National Assembly he saw as betraying the revolution. Marat's incendiary journalism helped channel popular anger into radical political action, and it set the tone for the populist rhetoric that would echo through future revolutions. This alliance between radicals and the working poor of Paris would drive key revolutionary moments. In October 1789, a crowd of working-class women, desperate from famine and increasingly radicalized by populists like Marat, marched to Versailles, the opulent palace that epitomized royal despotism. These working women then demanded that the king leave his royal sanctuary and return to Paris to live amongst the people. The National Guard escorted the women. It was hailed as a moment of revolutionary unity. Louis XVI even briefly styled himself as a people's king, though mostly out of fear. In his pamphlets and journals, Marat remained skeptical of the king's sincerity and continued his unrelenting attacks on the monarchy. Then, in June 1791, Marat's skepticism was confirmed. King Louis, Marie Antoinette, and the rest of the royal family snuck away in the middle of the night and attempted to escape Paris in what became known as the Flight to Varennes. They were caught and returned under guard, shattering any remaining trust in the monarchy. After the king's forced return, calls for a republic grew louder, and the moderate center began to fracture under the weight of popular anger. Paris was no longer content with symbols. It wanted guarantees. It wanted accountability. It wanted a republic. And so came the July confrontation. Tens of thousands of working Parisians marched to the Champ de Mars demanding their voices be heard. But there, raised before them, was the red flag of martial law, and the guns that fired on the people that day would set the future course of every revolution that followed. Interlude, A Banner of Blood. The Hôtel de Ville, August 1792. Georges Danton stood at the open window, sweat beading on the collar that hugged his enormous neck. In the square below, the crowd was a restless sea, pikes glinting, drums rattling the teeth in his skull. Behind him, in the chambers of the insurrectionary commune, men argued and stamped and threatened. But Danton was no longer listening. His eyes were fixed on the roofline where a red flag was being hauled up into the smoking dawn. His gut twisted. The taste of copper came into his mouth. That color. A year earlier, it had meant something very different. He blinked, and suddenly the stink of the Champ de Mars surged back. The heat, the dust, the blood. The petition laid out on the grass like a promise. That same red had snapped in the wind that day, but then it meant martial law. A warning from Lafayette. Go home or die. The surging crowd flickered in his memory. The musket fire, the bodies crumpling in the dirt. Men, women, and children scattered amidst shouts of horror and despair. Calling himself back, Danton saw that same defiant crowd before him now, that same shade of red flying above, but now inverted, claimed by the people, a warning in the opposite direction. The flag sagged, then snapped as it cleared the parapet. The square erupted. For this time, the red was not ordering the crowd back, but forward, declaring that the people would not back down. Danton exhaled slowly. The monarchy was finished. The revolution had chosen whose blood its banner would honor. He turned from the window. "Very well," he said. "Let us begin." On July the 17th, 1791, some 50,000 Parisians gathered at the Champ de Mars to demand an end to the monarchy. Georges Danton and other populist leaders from the Coterie drew up a petition calling for the king's removal, and thousands signed it. The National Guard, under the Marquis de Lafayette, charged with maintaining order in the capital, moved to disperse them. During the standoff, Lafayette raised a red flag, signaling that martial law was in effect and that the Guard was authorized to fire. The crowd stood firm, shots rang out, dozens were killed. The massacre at the Champ de Mars seared itself into popular memory as a betrayal. Lafayette's popularity declined and the red flag became a symbol of state repression. Meanwhile, tensions with the rest of Europe escalated. In August 1791, Austria and Prussia threatened to invade France if any harm came to the king. Many Parisians saw this as confirmation of a royalist conservative conspiracy to crush the revolution. In April 1792, the Legislative Assembly declared war on Austria, beginning over 2 decades of war that would fundamentally remake Europe. Early defeats at the front, coupled with food shortages, rising prices, and the recent trauma of the Champ de Mars massacre, fueled paranoia in Paris. Within this pressure cooker, radical Republicans like Jean-Paul Marat and Georges Danton gained further influence. Both were leaders in the Coterie Club, a democratic pressure group that brought together street militants of the sans-culottes and the city's most incendiary intellectuals. It was a kind of populist war room where the thinkers met the streets. The Coterie championed universal male suffrage, direct democracy, and the power of the crowd. On August the 9th, the Coterie, together with radical Jacobins, seized the Hôtel de Ville and declared an insurrectionary commune. The next day, an armed crowd, this time supported by a radicalized National Guard, stormed the Tuileries Palace, arrested the king, and effectively ended the monarchy. Within weeks, a republic was declared. After a series of sensational trials, King Louis and Queen Marie Antoinette would be executed by guillotine. The insurrection of August the 10th was a major turning point. The Commune had become the engine of revolutionary momentum in Paris. It was no longer just a municipal government. It was a force of populist radical power, backed by the streets and by the National Guard. The symbols of the revolution shifted with the mood. Following the insurrection, the red flag of martial law was raised over the Hôtel de Ville by the insurgents themselves. A year earlier, it had served as a warning to the people, but now it was reclaimed as a warning to the powerful, its first major appearance as a revolutionary emblem. In 1792 in Paris, the red flag, later immortalized in the banners of Soviet Russia and Communist China, and now synonymous with socialism, was raised by radical and working-class insurgents for the first time. It was still a banner of blood, yes, but no longer a deterrent. Now it was a promise. The revolution would not be stopped. Georges Danton became Minister of Justice directly following the insurrection, and under his leadership, the populist paranoia of the Coterie became revolutionary policy. In early September, as foreign armies closed in on Paris, rumors spread that royalists were plotting from inside the city's prisons. Mobs of sans-culottes, National Guardsmen, and volunteer militia began killing prisoners suspected of treason. The September massacres would last 4 days. Over 1,000 people were killed, some of them clergy and aristocrats, many more were simply common criminals. Church property was seized, priests rounded up and executed. Danton and Marat openly encouraged this purge. The violence shocked foreign observers, moderates, and even some revolutionaries. But for others, it was deemed necessary. preventative justice to protect the Republic from the enemies within. These massacres would foreshadow the much more terrible violence to come during the Reign of Terror, led by Robespierre and the Jacobins. From 1792 onward, the Paris Commune would remain at the center of revolutionary life. It organized insurrections, purged enemies, defended the Republic from within and without. It defined the radical edge of the revolution. This first commune, chaotic, hopeful, and often brutal, offered the earliest prototype of what a popular revolutionary government might look like. It was a lesson in the possibilities and dangers of street-driven democracy. For decades to come, the memory of the Commune and the symbol of the red flag would linger in the soul of the French left, part inspiration, part warning. The first Paris Commune may have been born out of chaos and paranoia, but it revealed something enduring. The revolutions were not just about parliaments and constitutions. They were about crowds, hunger, fear, and fury. In those early years, socialism did not yet have a name, but the questions that would come to define it were already in the air. Who speaks for the people? What is freedom without bread? What happens when the revolution eats itself? The answers were still unclear. But in the streets of Paris, a new kind of politics was beginning to take shape, one driven not just by ideals, but by necessity. And it was only just beginning. Chapter 2, The Phantoms of 93. All great world historic facts and personages appear, so to speak, twice. The first time as tragedy, the second as farce. The Revolution of 1848 was nothing but a parody of the Revolution of 1793. Karl Marx, the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte. Interlude: The Red Priest. The summer of 1793 was hot. The tall windows of the Salle du Manège, once a royal riding school, now the nerve center of the revolution, captured the heat like a vast greenhouse. The midday sun beat through the glass, baking the deputies and spectators alike. Large fans wagged lazily across the upper balcony. Handkerchiefs dabbed at glistening brows, and every so often a dull thud echoed through the noisy chamber as someone fainted from the heat. And yet, no one left. The carpenters, seamstresses, servants, nurses, masons, the beating heart of the sans-culottes, sat with rapt attention as the radical red priest, Jacques Roux, began his slow, deliberate march across the floor. The Salle du Manège was long and narrow, some 40 meters in length, a mere 10 meters wide, with high ceilings and tiered galleries running along both sides. As Roux ambled down the central aisle, the murmuring in the balconies rose to a low roar. He walked with a mission, a verdict, and the people above him, Parisians with hoarse voices and calloused hands, greeted him like a gladiator approaching a lion. On the convention floor, the tension was electric. To Roux's right, deputies whispered nervously, casting sideways glances toward the galleries. These were men of property, men who spoke of liberty but feared the mob. To his left, some Montagnard Jacobins offered restrained nods of approval, more performance than conviction, always with one wary eye on the people above, whose very presence hung over them like a blade. And Jacques Roux, his robes dyed a stark, blood-deep red in honor of the people's sacrifice, stopped at the speaker's platform, unfolded his manifesto, and raised his voice. Delegates of the French people, 100 times this hall has rung with the crimes of egoists and knaves. Freedom is nothing but a vain phantom when one class of men can starve another with impunity. Loud calls of approval echoed from above. Equality is nothing but a vain phantom when the rich, he spat out that word like rotten meat, through monopoly claim the right of life or death over their fellow man. The Republic is nothing but a vain phantom when the counter-revolution operates each day through the price of bread and soap, commodities that 3/4 of all citizens cannot afford without shedding tears. Roux paused, sweat streaking down his contorted face. He turned his gaze toward the Montagnards, his supposed allies, and now spoke directly to them. Can the property of knaves, he pointed across the aisle, be more sacred than the life of a man? Armed force is at the disposal of administrative bodies. How can they not be able to requisition those goods necessary to life? A rotting tomato suddenly flew across the aisle and burst red on an empty bench left vacant since the last purge. The freedom of commerce is the right to use and to make use of, and not the right to tyrannize and prevent use. Those goods necessary to all should be delivered at a price accessible to all. A delegate in a silk waistcoat began to rise in protest, but his voice was overtaken by a chorus of shouts from the pews above him. As the jeers grew louder, Roux raised his arms slowly toward the windows above as light caught on the red Phrygian cap that shadowed his long, haggard face. "Pronounce then, and the sans-culottes with their pikes will see your decrees fulfilled." There was a moment of stunned silence, then an explosion from above. Women cried out and hurled their large fans into the air. Children banged on the floorboards with their heels, and men growled in approval. The entire gallery shook, and the ceiling above the delegates quivered with the fury of the people. Jacques Roux gave this speech before the National Convention on June the 25th, 1793. Just one day after the deputies had passed the Constitution of 1793, the most radically egalitarian political document in modern European history. It promised universal male suffrage, public education, social welfare, freedom of the press, and the right to protest. Roux appeared that day not to celebrate its ratification, but to challenge the convention to make good on its promises. Though not a deputy of the convention, Roux had been elected to the Paris Commune in 1791 and emerged as one of the most radical voices of the sans-culottes. While many Jacobins focused on constitutional government and protection of property, Roux demanded economic equality, bread, not just rights. His faction, known as the Enragés, the enraged ones, called for price controls, punishment of hoarders, and the redistribution of wealth, a vision that directly challenged the limits of emergent liberalism and laid early groundwork for later socialist thought. So, how did we get here? And well, by early 1793, the National Convention, dominated by middle-class lawyers and merchants, had grown increasingly unpopular among the Parisian poor. And then the arrest of Jean-Paul Marat in April ignited working-class anger. Though never formally an Enragé, Marat shared their rage. Like Roux, he championed the poor, denounced hoarders, and distrusted the moderate faction, who were known as the Girondins. But unlike them, Marat wielded power from within. As a delegate of the convention, he relentlessly attacked the Girondins for betraying the sans-culottes and weakening the revolution. The Girondins retaliated, charging Marat with inciting violence and instigating the September massacres. But this move backfired terribly. Acquitted largely thanks to his popularity, Marat was carried from the courthouse on the shoulders of his supporters, already a martyr to the radical cause even before his death. Then, in late May, the revolutionary left struck back. The Paris Commune, backed by a radicalized National Guard, launched a third insurrection. From May the 31st to June the 2nd, 1793, armed workers and guardsmen surrounded the convention and demanded the expulsion of the Girondins. It marked perhaps the most dramatic instance in French history of urban workers directly reshaping the national government through force of insurrection. For many contemporaries, it seemed as if the people of Paris themselves had now seized control of the revolution. And the results were immediate. The Girondins, who had literally sat on the right side of the chamber, were now gone. The radical Jacobins, known as the Montagnards, or the Mountain, who sat on the left, now held power. They moved swiftly to draft a new constitution for the Republic. The Constitution of 1793 was the first in history to guarantee universal male suffrage. Nearly 1.8 million citizens voted to ratify it. It was a resounding popular mandate, and the document itself was radical not just in its scope, but in its spirit. It guaranteed civil liberties such as freedom of speech, religion, and assembly, but it also proclaimed a whole new category of rights: the right to work, to public assistance, to education. And perhaps most radically, it enshrined the right of insurrection, the duty of citizens to rise up if their government violated the public good. This was a republic that aspired to be not only free, but fair, a state that promised justice, bread, and representation for the working class. And so it was in this environment that Jacques Roux delivered what would come to be known as the Manifesto of the Enragés, demanding that the convention make good on its promises. But the promise of a social republic would not last. In retrospect, the insurrection of late May and the ratification of the Constitution of 1793 marked the high point of radical hope, and that hope would be short-lived. With France facing war abroad and rebellion at home, the Jacobins suspended the Constitution, declaring it would not be implemented until peace returned. Power was then consolidated under Maximilien Robespierre and the Committee of Public Safety. And so began the revolution's most infamous chapter, the Reign of Terror. Though remembered for its guillotines and purges, the terror turned not only on aristocrats and moderates, but also on the radical left. As the Jacobins centralized their authority, Jacques Roux and the Enragés continued to agitate from below, demanding bread, justice, and direct democracy through mass mobilization. And while the Jacobins had once relied on the threat of Enragés insurrection to purge their enemies, they now saw Roux and his followers as a destabilizing force. Roux was arrested on dubious charges, and facing likely execution, he took his own life in February 1794. Robespierre then dismissed him as a, quote, madman, using the incident to justify broader repression of the Enragés and other radical leftists. Even Georges Danton, once a leading voice of the Mountain, began calling for clemency and an end to the terror, and so he too would be swept away by the guillotine in April 1794. And so the voice of the streets was silenced. Popular revolution gave way to centralized control. And by the spring of 1794, the great experiment of the streets had been strangled, not by royalists, but by the revolution itself. Robespierre, inspired by Rousseau, envisioned a republic of virtue, but one enforced through surveillance, censorship, and the guillotine. And even when the Jacobins enacted popular social policies, like the law of the maximum, which imposed price limits, they did so from above, not through grassroots power. The insurrection of 1793 marked both the apex of sans-culotte power and the beginning of its collapse. In July 1794, Robespierre would be overthrown in the Thermidorian reaction, ending the Reign of Terror. But the violence did not stop. Soon, reactionary gangs known as the Muscadins, mobs of well-to-do young men, the so-called gilded youth, began roaming Paris, attacking Jacobins and sans-culottes alike. The White Terror that followed crushed what remained of the radical left and silenced its surviving leaders. By 1795, the French Revolution had moved well past its most radical phase, and from this point on, the story becomes one of the rising power of a young, ambitious general named Napoleon Bonaparte, who would become first consul in 1799 and then emperor in 1804. But the legacy of 1793 would endure. For generations of leftists, the sans-culottes and the First Paris Commune became symbols of popular power. Their dream of mass democracy, economic justice, and a republic built by and for the poor would echo through future revolutions. And as the 19th century unfolded, a new generation of thinkers, those calling themselves socialists for the first time, would look back on 1793 not just as a moment of upheaval, but as a blueprint and a warning. They would claim as their martyrs the names of Jean-Paul Marat, Jacques Roux, and the other phantoms of 93, figures who had dared to imagine that liberty meant nothing without equality, and that revolutions must feed the people as well as free them. For those who came of age under Napoleon and later the Bourbon Restoration, the French Revolution was no longer a lived experience, but a legendary memory. And the meaning of 1793 became hotly contested on the revolutionary left. To some, the violence of the Jacobin terror was a tragic necessity, a purifying fire required to sweep away privilege and forge a new egalitarian order. To others, it was a cautionary tale, a warning about the dangers of centralization, moral absolutism, and the silencing of dissent. Beneath these disagreements lay a deeper philosophical fault line, the enduring tension between freedom and equality. Was the Jacobin Terror a flawed but genuine attempt to create a more just society, or was it a descent into tyranny cloaked in the language of virtue? In short, can a revolution be equal without becoming unfree, and can it be free without becoming unequal? Chapter 3. The Conspiracy of Equals. A quote from Sylvain Maréchal from the Manifesto of the Equals, 1796. The French Revolution is only half complete. We want not just equality written in laws, but in fact. Interlude. The Ovine Hell. For Gracchus Babeuf, it wasn't the chains that bothered him, it was the sheep. He had grown used to chains, prison was familiar, but Vendôme was something else entirely. A quiet provincial town 100 miles from the revolution's heart. It was cold, gray, and heavy with a silence that pressed on his chest like frost. The fields stretched out in dull brown patches, rimmed with ice, and scattered across them, everywhere, were sheep. Dozens, hundreds, just always sheep. Since arriving, Babeuf had begun having recurring nightmares. In his dreams, he was one of them, wandering the fields, chewing grass, mindless content. Then the dogs would come. Silent and lean, they drove the flock tighter and tighter until he could see nothing but wool. No sky, no horizon, just the crush of bodies. Then as he realized he could no longer move, a blade would fall from the sky, and he'd wake, sweating in his cell. He had hoped the trial would be short. Death at least would end this ovine hell, but it dragged on for months. Day after day of bureaucratic theater. He was shuttled from one sterile courtroom to another, while a judge droned on about treason against the state, counter-revolutionary activity, inciting the mob. Yes, Babeuf thought, that was the point. But today was different. Today he would finally have a chance to speak. He wouldn't be speaking before a great assembly in Paris as he had once dreamed. No crowd, no people's tribune, just a dull room, a carpeted floor, and a secretary with an ink-stained cuff. Still, he hoped that offering his defense would bring him some relief. Babeuf found himself in a medium-sized chamber with walls clad in gray fabric. The air was thick. The judge's words, when they came, seemed swallowed before they even reached his ears. He nearly nodded off, but then an elbow. A nudge from one of the guards. It was his turn. He rose. His chains scraped the floor but made no sound. He shuffled forward and stopped beneath the judge's bench. The man stared at him, face blank and unmoving. Babeuf didn't speak to him. He turned instead to the secretary and steadied his breath. If no one here would listen, perhaps someone someday would read. The purpose of society is the common welfare. It is this formula, comprised within the first article of the 1793 Constitution, Year 1 of the Republic, that I have always held as my own, and I will continue to do so. No response, just the slow scratch of the secretary's pen. The aim of the revolution is the well-being of the greatest number. Therefore, if this goal has not yet been achieved, if the people have not found the better life they were seeking, then the revolution is not over. Even though those who merely wish to substitute their rule for someone else's say that it is over, as you would expect them to. He paused, allowing these next words to sink in. If the revolution is really over, then it has been nothing but a great crime. The judge flinched, barely, but in the choking quiet of the courtroom it felt like a scream. Babeuf lifted the parchment in front of him. Bold black letters shone across the top. The Tribune of the People. I was not being fanciful, citizen jurors, when I said this trial is the trial of every philosopher in the Pantheon. You accuse them of corrupting me. Malby, Helvetius, Diderot, Jean-Jacques Rousseau. His voice steadied with each name. I will not repent. I will not blaspheme their memory. If the axe must fall upon my neck, the lictor will find me ready. It is good to perish for the sake of virtue. He exhaled. A juror stirred. The judge did not move. The secretary's pen continued to scratch. On May the 26th, 1797, Babeuf was sentenced to death. Some reports claim that he struck himself several times in the courtroom after hearing his sentence. The very next day, he was executed by guillotine, and in the fields outside Vendôme, the trees began to bloom and the sheep continued to graze. By 1796, the mood in Paris had changed dramatically. Years of war, hunger, and revolutionary violence had left the city exhausted. The radical energy of 1793 had dissipated, replaced by fear, repression, and disillusionment. Both terrors, the Jacobin terror under Robespierre and the White Terror under the Thermidorians, targeted left-wing populists and members of the sans-culottes. The brief experiment in street-driven democracy was now over. In its place stood a republic dominated by elites implementing top-down policies that largely ignored the working poor. The Constitution of 1793, with its promise of social reform and egalitarian democracy, had never been implemented. Robespierre and the Jacobins shelved it in favor of revolutionary discipline and their so-called Republic of Virtue. This created a rift between the Jacobins and the sans-culottes that would never fully heal. After Robespierre's fall, the Thermidorians proved even less responsive to popular demands. And because Robespierre had claimed to rule in the name of the people, all forms of working-class radicalism were now tainted by association with the guillotine. So, even as the social republic envisioned in 1793 remained unrealized, its very memory had become discredited. In its place, a new constitution was ratified in 1795, establishing the Directory, a conservative regime that paved the way for the rise of Napoleon Bonaparte. But repression did not extinguish revolutionary politics. It simply forced it underground. And in that underground, something new began to take shape. No longer led by street preachers and populist agitators like Marat, Danton, or Roux, this next wave of radicals produced a new type of figure, the professional revolutionary. An early prototype of this figure was Gracchus Babeuf, a radical journalist who, in 1796, launched the Conspiracy of Equals, a planned coup against the Directory with the aim of creating a truly egalitarian republic. If Marat had demanded liberty and Roux had demanded bread, Babeuf sought to redeem both, but without all the bloodshed. And though his conspiracy was quickly crushed, its legend endured. In the years leading up to his conspiracy, Babeuf had been hounded by the Directory and the Muscadins. During the White Terror, his papers were burned, he was repeatedly jailed, and yet he remained undeterred. As inflation soared and hunger returned, his calls for economic justice gained traction among disaffected soldiers, working-class Parisians, and surviving Jacobins. He openly called for a return to the Constitution of 93, and posters around Paris declared, quote, "Nature has given to every man the right to the enjoyment of an equal share in all property." His song, Dying of Hunger, Dying of Cold, was sung in cafes and in workshops. For a moment, it seemed as if the fire of 1793 might be rekindled. But Babeuf no longer believed in spontaneous mass uprisings. The chaos of the Reign of Terror and the repression of Thermidor had convinced him that what the revolution needed most of all was structure. He turned away from the street mobilization of Marat, Danton, and Roux, and instead envisioned a disciplined conspiratorial vanguard, a small band of committed revolutionaries who would seize power and enact justice on behalf of the people. But in the end, the conspiracy was betrayed. Babeuf and his comrades were arrested, and after a 4-month trial, he was executed by guillotine. For years, Babeuf remained a marginal figure. His proto-socialist ideas were considered too radical, even for many surviving Jacobins. But one of Babeuf's co-conspirators was an Italian activist named Philippe Buonarroti. And though arrested, Buonarroti escaped execution and was instead sentenced to life in prison. In 1799, as Napoleon Bonaparte rose to power, Buonarroti was released in a general amnesty. And like many radicals, he lived out the years of the French Empire in exile, drifting from Geneva to Brussels before returning to Paris. Then, in 1828, Buonarroti published a book, The History of Babeuf's Conspiracy for Equality. It was widely read by a new generation of revolutionaries who saw Babeuf not as a failure, but as a visionary, his ideas simply ahead of their time. Babeuf's vision of an egalitarian social republic would go on to inspire figures like Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. His conception of revolution led by a disciplined vanguard was later taken up by Louis-Auguste Blanqui. Blanqui's model of a tightly organized revolutionary elite would then, in turn, inform aspects of Vladimir Lenin's theory of the vanguard party, though Lenin fused this approach with Marxist analysis to create a distinctly modern ideological form of revolutionary leadership. But more on that once we get to Leninism. But in short, Babeuf's legacy would shape early socialist and communist theory and ignite enduring debates about leadership, participation, and legitimacy on the revolutionary left. As the 19th century dawned, Napoleon would seize power and revolutionary energy began to recede. But the ghosts of 1793, Jean-Paul Marat, Jacques Roux, Georges Danton, Gracchus Babeuf, continued to haunt the radical left, and they would become touchstones for a new generation of revolutionaries. In the decades ahead, that generation would gather once more in Paris, and these revolutionaries, reformers, and intellectuals would be the first to explicitly call themselves socialists. In Paris, we'll meet Auguste Blanqui, the conspirator who believed revolution must be seized by a disciplined elite. Louis Blanc, the reformer who sought to guarantee work for the urban poor. And Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, whose audacious critiques of property and authority helped lay the foundations of modern anarchism. And then we'll also meet Eugénie Niboyer, Flora Tristan, Claire Demar, Jeanne Dorén, and other pioneers of socialist feminism, women who demanded that the revolution not just include workers, but women. The ways these figures interpreted the legacy of 1793 would define the ideological rifts within every revolution that followed. Blanqui's followers would argue for a centralized revolutionary vanguard. Blanc's would attempt to reform the state through cooperative workshops. Proudhon's would press for a decentralized socialism from below, seeking to harmonize liberty and equality. And then the early feminist socialists would insist that no liberation would be complete without gender equality. Together, these figures represent the foundational fault lines of the socialist tradition. Authoritarian versus democratic, top-down versus bottom-up, revolutionary versus reformist, and then the ever-urgent question of inclusion. And so, as we will see in our next narrative episode in 1848, the so-called Year of Revolution, these ideas would once more be tested in the furnace of ideology, when the people of Paris rose up once again to spark a wave of revolutions that would ripple across Europe and unfurl the red flag in spring. But before we leap forward to 1848, we need to linger a bit longer in 1793. For perhaps no group of revolutionaries has shaped modern politics, especially in its most radical forms, more than the Jacobins. So, in our next episode, we'll explore what is Jacobinism and consider the paradox of virtue and terror, the dream of moral regeneration, and the lasting imprint of Robespierre's Republic of Virtue on the modern left. From Karl Marx to Slavoj Žižek, the Jacobin spirit has remained both an inspiration and a warning. So join me next time for What is Jacobinism? Virtue, Terror, and the Birth of the Radical Left.
Le gilet bien court, les tons desserrés, roulant sans vêtements, cueillis mon rêve du pendant du rêve. Cerise d'Hermone, elle rose appareil, du bon sur les mous, sans goutte de sang, mais je l'ai bien court, les tons de série.
Ism is written and produced by me, Matt Payne. The original musical score is composed by Ian Payne. Our theme song is performed by Aloe Vera on vocals and banjo, with accompaniment from Ian and myself. If you're curious how I build these narrative scenes, where I source the quotes, what lines are verbatim, altered, or composed to capture the essence of a moment, you'll find full transcripts, suggested readings, show notes, and behind-the-scenes looks at my process on the Ism Substack. The link is in the episode description. To learn more about Ian's work, you'll also find his website there. And if you'd like to reach out, you can email me at ismhistorypodcast@gmail.com. Thanks so much for listening, and I will see you next time.